I was at a racism workshop. I think I told the story in the book some years ago, and just by the luck of how we were sitting, I was the last one to share in the opening circle. And when it was my turn to speak, I said, well, the issue I'm looking at most closely is this question of emptiness that I see in my culture. And a black man jumped out of his chair and pointed at me and said, that's it. Until you are willing to look at this as a people, you will continue to kill us and steal from us every single day.
Mm.
Part of my work, a part of white culture's work, is to recognize how deep this emptiness goes and how much we've relied upon supremacies of all kinds to try to fill that emptiness. Supremacy over nature, supremacy over other genders, supremacy over other races. This is how we have tried to mitigate against this feeling in our psyches that we are, in a sense, essentially empty, because we have abandoned all of what that deep ancestral inheritance was meant to support, which is, in a sense, living culture. We've abandoned living culture, and what we've become fixated on is the cult of individualism. There's no culture in individualism. There's just
Yeah.
a frenetic attempt to shore up the boundaries of my own self-shaped identity.
And that's why I'm so grateful there are people like you who have somehow through luck or fortune or wisdom or something have found the way, found the path, and brought new medicine, like medicine that's fit for our post-industrial, let's say, culture. So we can perhaps use the old wisdom, but find it in a way that is suitable for ourselves and real and alive.
That's a very important point you're bringing up, Connor, which is around that ritual is one of the primary responses to grief. But we can't just import rituals from other cultures. That's part of colonialism. That's part of trying to fill the emptiness. We have to become courageous enough to listen to the grief and to the earth, and to have rituals dreamt up through us now that are responsive to where we are. Like keening for you, for the Irish, that's a native indigenous tradition right there. You didn't have to bring that from any place else. We have to begin to really refrain from that kind of theft, that kind of co-optation of other people's spiritual resource. That's theirs too. The wounds are the same, the needs are the same, the values are the same cross-culturally. The practices have to become particular. How do people, like say here, North America, here in California, how are our psyches shaped by our experience? And what rituals do we need that would begin to repair our relationship to land, our relationship to community, our relationship to soul? That's what I keep trying to listen to. That's what I keep trying to bring into practice, are those rituals. I remember some years ago, my friend Maladoma Some and I were teaching together for a number of years, I think 5 or 6 years, and these rituals were coming into my imagination, not mine, they were dreamt up. And we would do the ritual. And he would say to me, that ritual belongs here, but you would not see that in my village. That was something that was dreamt up and acknowledging the particular shape of the psyches of the people here. So there was a fit between psyche and practice. That's what we need to do. Does that make sense?
Brilliant. Absolutely, yeah. I guess in your book you say we need to recover our ritual literacy, and I suppose it's in us. We know it, and we need to create containers where it happens. So I'm hoping that you might share a bit of your experience in how to do that. Um, I know in your book you have a great section at the end with resources for different different parts of grief recovery and self-compassion and things like that. Wonderful, really, really great inclusion. Um, and I guess I have some questions around your grief rituals. That you've been doing it, I think, since 1997. And you said at the start there was a bit of gentle persuasion that was needed to
Right,
for
right.
people to realize the importance.
Yeah, it was hard to sell the ticket. You know, people didn't want to spend the weekend crying. They didn't want to. Why would I do that? You know, it's good shows on TV this weekend, and there's a sale at the mall. But now, we put the word out for a grief ritual, and it's literally filled typically in a matter of hours. Uh, the need. That's why I'm saying that the denial is beginning to really break. That we're not in serious trouble. That that fiction is breaking, and so the grief is really rising. But in response to your question, um, I think we have to be willing to just experiment. I can't tell you what rituals you should do. I can tell you the process that I've gone through is to identify a need. What is the need? Well, one of the needs was for all those outcast parts of us, how do we bring them back? And is that my job alone, or is that another communal practice? Well, I went through a process. I had an experience which I've shared in many different lecture series of being taken to an edge through a woman healer and being told in kind of a deep altered state that I must gather together all that's been made not sacred. That's the words that the ancestors gave me. You must gather together all that has been made not sacred. Well, I didn't have a clue how to do that. The message was clear, and I knew exactly what they were talking about. They were talking about all these outcast parts of me, but how do I gather them back together again? So I had some powerful experiences that happened that gave me an inclination for how to do that, and I fulfilled that part of it. But then a while later, I had a dream that said, that was not meant for you alone. The dreamer said, that's the work of your people right now. You must all gather together what's been made not sacred. And then this ritual came into my imagination, which is a communal soul retrieval. Now, who ever heard of a communal soul retrieval before? I haven't. I've heard that shamans and healers would go and do a soul retrieval for you. They'd bring back fragments of your soul or your whole soul. But this is now a communal soul retrieval. So that's what I'm saying is identify a need and then be open and receptive to dreaming. How could we begin to articulate this ritual process to respond to this particular need at this time and be willing to fail? Be
Take a
willing to
risk.
try and risk, yeah. Be willing to try it and go, I didn't do it. But this one element I liked. Let's keep that. And you keep refining the ritual until you can go, this one sings, this one has vitality, this one has vibrancy to it. This one takes us in the direction of what we're trying to repair and heal.
Right, because you've been working for a long time, maybe in the same community or
Yeah.
with some communities over time, and I
Yeah.
guess there's no way, like you say, the wild edge of sorrow. There's no way you're gonna be able to just have a standardized ritual that people are gonna let the big emotions move in.
No, 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 you have to really be, rituals are very organic beings. If you treat them almost like they're living creatures, you can begin the ritual going in one direction, but you have to be willing to flow where it wants to go. It'll take you where it wants to go. And if it's a living process, it's like, sometimes we go to a church service and they're beautiful. They have what I make the distinction, I think, in the book between the horizontal and the vertical dimensions. The horizontal dimension is the communal dimension, which I call ceremony. I know some people don't like that language because they think ceremony and ritual are the same, and it can be. But I call that ceremonial space where we reinforce our communal bonds with one another. And then there's the ritual access.
Mm.
This access is the one that's utterly unpredictable. I don't want to come out of the ritual space the same as I went in. I want to be deranged. I want to be shaken. I want to be remade in the process of that ritual.
Mm.
So that's the one we're afraid of because, as we said a little earlier, we're supposed to always be in control of our emotions.
Mm.
Well, ritual says, no, we want to take you to the
Yeah.
edge of which you will be willing to let go of that control. And like the man in your story, he had to express and confront the emotions that we do not want to feel and experience, but
Mm.
we know what we need to. So
Yeah.
that's what ritual offers us. And that requires a lot of attunement to the gesture of the ritual and the psyches that are entering into that ritual space.
Yeah. Maybe I remember the one case from the book you mentioned was a nun who had, I think she'd been shut down in some way by her mother superior from grieving, uh, or shut some part of her soul down, and so you agreed to do some work with her, and you said in the book that you needed 2 weeks to prepare with the group. It was a new group, um, for the to get them ready for the ritual space. So how did that process take place, if you could remember?
Well, she shared a heartbreaking story of her father's dying and being told by her superiors that if she leaves to go to the funeral, she can't come back to the convent. And if she stays, she cannot cry. And so she chose to stay. And this was when she was 15 years old. And I met her when she was probably 75 or 80. So she'd been carrying that grief for 60 or 65 years, unexpressed.
Mm.
And she said at the beginning of the class, I was doing some drumming and I invited the participants in the class to get up and move and dance. And most of the students in my class at this university were nuns and priests on sabbatical, ironically, having been raised a good Catholic boy. Uh, they did. They got up and danced, and she came to me at the break and said, "Well, when you drummed, all of this memory and feeling came rushing back to the foreground. It's like the drum quickened her body and loosened the manacles of repression on her grief." And I told her, "I promise you in 2 weeks, we will do some grief work in a communal grief ritual with this. But we have to talk to the other students and invite their grief into the circle." And I can't tell you the depth of grief that these people were carrying, because they were the ones who were the hearers of sorrow, but not the revealers of sorrow. They were
Yes.
the caretakers of the flock, of the congregation, but they had no space to take their own grief.
Mm.
So when we got to the ritual, and I said an invocation and taught them a song, I did the prayer, and this nun, her name was Agnes, she made a beeline down to that shrine, and she was on her belly, sobbing and sobbing and sobbing.
Mm.
And in this ritual, you can go back and forth from the shrine as many times as you want. And so she'd make this migration, this pilgrimage back and forth from the village to the shrine. And finally, one time she was sitting there, and I called over to her over the drum, and I said, "Agnes, are you done?" And she said, "No, I just need a break." So,
Ah.
and she went up there one more time, and she sat there silently this time. No more tears. She sat very quietly and then came back, and we finished the ritual. And I said, "Does anybody want to share anything?" And she said, "The last time I went up there, I saw a Native American woman with an infant in her arms." She said, "I was that infant. This was the first time I felt like I belonged in this world." And, obviously more tears come from that. And so the story is so important because it's never too late. It's never too late. 65 years can go by, and you can still, in the right context, when your psychic ear picks up the hum of that energetic field, this is what I've been waiting for.
Mm.
You can go. You can do the work. You can empty the cup to some degree. That's why you repeat rituals over and over again, so you can slowly empty the cup and begin to fill it up the next day. And in a sane world and in a sane culture, we would be grieving every other week, at least once a month together, so that we could stay current in our life. Because most of the time, we're chewing on bones from our past and
Yeah.
from our ancestral past. We're rarely in the current moment. And so we do grief work to get current, but not just in the sense of being in the present, but also being in the current of life, the electricity of life. We're supposed to be vitally alive,
Part of the soul of the world.
part of the soul of the world. But when we're digesting or carrying around this sediment of grief, we are flattened, we
Yeah.
are sedated, we are sedimented into
Plus,
our
yeah, like you mentioned, then when something big does happen, you're ready. You've got
right.
the muscles to
Yes,
deal
yes.
with it. So you mentioned like that, yeah, every ritual needs to be alive and done with imagination and authenticity for that constellation, that synchronicity that's there. But I wonder if you've come up with tools that a toolbox that you dip into, like you mentioned a shrine, and in one description of a ritual in the book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, you mentioned the shrine where people are approaching the shrine, and that's where they release. And then there's witnesses that are holding the space. I think the witnesses, as I understand it, weren't part of the grieving. They were just there to witness and support one of the
Right,
grievers.
right, right.
Um, and
Yeah.
the shrine has images and something that is
Mhm.
an association of a deep
Right.
grief or love for the person.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, when you think of a funeral, there's usually a photograph of the person we're grieving. But when you think about a communal grief ritual, that shrine is filled with ancestral images. And it might have artifacts, objects, a cup, a stone. It might have anything that elicits, that calls out the grief from your body. That's what you want on the other side of that shrine when you approach that. Now, shrines are, you can find that on almost any culture. What is taught, I was taught some of this part of this ritual from my dear friend Malidoma Some, and he was kind enough to share this ritual and allow me to use this portion of the ritual, which is the attendant, what they call the container, the person who goes down to the shrine with you. I haven't seen that in many other cultures, but I love this image so much because we are so alone in our grief that part of the healing in this ritual is to know that I'm not alone in this grief, that someone has got my back. Someone is sitting here holding a space, just witnessing my grieving. That is so incredibly healing to our industrialized, individualized, technologized selves, that I'm actually being seen and felt and witnessed. And then that container person brings you back to the village for a welcome back. That's
yeah,
incredibly healing. It's incredibly healing to not be alone in our grief.
yeah, often it can be just having a contradiction to the distress message that can help us just to release what we need to release.
Yeah, yeah.
And one more thing, I invited a couple of people who are, I guess, colleagues in being interested in grief work, if they had any questions. And there was one from Tanya. Um, if you have time, I could ask you.
One more that I have to
Yeah,
go.
great. So she asked, do you think grief is a necessary human task with a higher purpose, a gateway to a kind of heart-shattering self-realization that is intrinsic to transfiguration, or may I say the long-term, unavoidable experience of these gates? Once we receive the gift fully and interpret the deeper experience outside of ego. Um, so I guess, yeah, I think you mentioned something in the book about this grief being a threshold to
Yeah. Well, let's imagine it as as an apprenticeship. That your grief work over the long haul, if you take up this apprenticeship and you realize that grief is inescapable, and you begin to do something like turn toward it and develop this companionship with it, you are worked by grief over the long walk, but you're also asked to work grief over the long walk. And in that old language of apprenticing, let's say you apprentice to a painter or to a farrier or
Or a craftsman.
cabinet maker. That would take a 5, 10, 15 year, sometimes a 20-year apprenticeship before you would be granted the name master. You're a master, carpenter or whatever. In the work of soul, this apprenticeship with grief doesn't lead to mastery. It ultimately leads to elderhood. So it isn't about self-transformation. It is about self-ripening for the sake thereof. That I undergo this ordeal of digesting and metabolizing grief, not so I come out of it better or less encumbered by grief, but so that I can be a presence in the community that can help others hold their own, particularly the young ones. An elder is someone who has learned how to develop a capacity to keep their face turned into the winds of grief, knowing that loss is inevitable and still remaining robust in their humor, their love, and their affection for the world, and to be able to, again, stay present through what they call gravitas, someone who carries a dignified bearing in the presence of suffering. That's really the long ripening of the intention of grief. It's not meant to take us hostage. It's not meant to somehow make us better people. It actually is part of our maturation. It's a long initiation. It's a long apprenticeship. And in the end, our work is to become a solid, robust presence, an elder in the community.
And may many such elders lead the way in the future.
May that be so. May that be so.
Francis Weller, thanks so much for taking the time to talk. I know you're very busy, and I appreciate you putting your soul into books and being willing to come and talk to me.
Conor, I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. I appreciated the questions, and I hope this feeds you and your listeners. Take care.
So, thanks.
All
So, Francis Weller, book The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and many more wonderful books. Thank you.
You bet.